When everything goes wrong, I'm like, I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. When of course I'm not. Those are the things that blow up kind of collaborations and communities quite fast in unresolved conflict. So if we can find ways to practice that, if we can create developmental spaces, if we can create places which we're really cultivating these capacities and these new practices and experiments that they may also involve technology, they may involve just relational and cultural things. But if we can be innovating and discovering and sharing, wow, there's real potential for breakthrough here.
Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Rufus is an entrepreneur, activist, and author, as well as a long-term Zen practitioner. He is passionate about finding wiser, weller ways to live together. He wants his child and all children to live in a world of love, abundance, and wisdom. Wouldn't that be nice, right? Rufus has founded several successful for-profit and non-profit initiatives, and some unsuccessful ones, haven't we all, including Life Itself, Open Knowledge Foundation, and Datatopian. His 2018 book, Open Revolution, is about making a radically fairer and freer information age. Welcome, Rufus.
Well, thank you, Jim, for having me. It's lovely to be here with you.
So let's talk about the arc of your development and your interests. And again, I could see it following my own arc to some degree, which is, at first, you thought information will make us free, right? As I mentioned, I started out in the online world in 1980, where I worked for The Source, the world's first consumer online service. We were passionate. We passionately believed that more and accessible and more accurate information couldn't be anything but wonderful for citizenship, right? And that there'll be a renaissance of democracy and culture and everything else. And I suspect you had a similar view at one point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in my life, and I grew up actually on a farm, which is unusual, but I was very curious since I was a kid. And I also quite early on had some kind of, I guess you'd say, almost social justice like feeling. Maybe like, I think related, often these things come from childhood. Like, I didn't get on that well on the playground. I actually realize now later in my life that I'm probably on the autistic spectrum. I wasn't great at always getting on with other kids. And part of that, though, was a real realization. I do remember this kind of epiphany. I was about 8 or 9. And there was a kind of bully, kind of boy who was kind of picking on the others, maybe me a little bit, but maybe others. I was like, well, if we all stood together, this person would be powerless. But of course, I did not successfully persuade everyone to stand with me. And that was just kind of, I think really early on, I both wanted this aspect of fairness, or like the world was unjust in this way, maybe to me in some ways, obviously as a child, but more like I could see it in the world around me. I remember seeing pictures of famines in the late 80s on television and being told about them at school. And the part that was also was that how did these deep changes happen? How did we have a world where there was no bullying in the playground? I started to think about these things even as a teenager, and I was also quite a keen student of history. So I had these two loves really intellectually in my life, which one was mathematics and the other was history. And both of them, I feel, are about patterning. I also love Ursula Le Guin, the master patterner in The Wizard of Earth, is that, and this idea of patterning and of seeing the patterns of the world, and not that they're exact, not that you can exactly, predict, but you can learn from them. And so that was leading me really to look for things where there were long levers. What are ways of making society better that are kind of, you can really have a lot of leverage? And maybe mistakenly, and I kind of fell into it, to be honest, was I got into information, who owns the information age? Who, late 90s, early 2000s, the internet's just arrived in a mass way, and who's going to own this world? How's it going to be regulated and controlled? And I got into that. I got into activism there, and I got into starting the Open Knowledge Foundation. And long story short, I think that there were some real successes, but I think the simplest thing, and I still believe in that. That's why I wrote the book, The Open Revolution. And what I was seeing was maybe open knowledge does not make open minds. In a nutshell, it was like, okay, you could have all this information available, but does it actually make democracy better, or does it actually make a real difference societally without some shift in our consciousness, in our culture, in our institutions at some deeper level?
And I've pondered this question myself, right? Why is it that the world seems to have gone insane despite having access to the greatest thoughts ever thunk, right? You can pull down all the Greeks in either Greek or Latin or English or any other language you want. We have the ability to talk to each other in various granularities, and yet you look at our politics and our culture, it seems to have become substantially worse. And, one wonders about that and wonders if some of it may not be some basic limits of human information processing, that we are overwhelmed with interrupts. Think about the hunter-gatherer days where we spent 95% of our evolutionary history, and there's a certain amount of stuff going on, and somebody had to respond to real time. Jaguar jumps out of the bush, you better have the ability to do something about that, right? But you weren't pinged with, literally hundreds and perhaps thousands of interrupts per day. Do you want these cookies or not? Blah blah blah. And I suspect that part of the decay of sense making has been just too many interrupts, irrespective of what the content is.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. What I would call sometimes the info veganism point, which is just as we have too many calories in the form of sugar and processed foods, and we were adapted for a world where there wasn't much sugar to eat. Similarly, we were adapted for a world where there wasn't as much kind of sugary information around, and we kind of are information obese. I guess for me, you asked like also my journey was I also quite early on, I got quite interested in psychedelics as a teenager, basically because I was reading a psychopharmacology textbook in the school library. For whatever reason, I was quite a curious child reading different things. I was not at all into drugs or anything like that. I read this book and it's like got this whole section on psychedelics, and I'm then like, whoa, well, no one, what's that? And I go and do more research, pre-internet days, which meant you had to buy books. And long story short was I got quite interested also in consciousness and then in Zen and meditation. And I say that because that was the other side of the story for me, was maybe a little bit of a failure of what one would imagine would be the benefits of, as you say, more information and so on. We'd all be better, more rational, more sensible. But on the other hand, I had all this kind of teaching from Buddhism that even before the information age, well, humans weren't nearly as rational as you thought. If you did meditation and you looked at your own life, I just suddenly became a lot more present, that I didn't do kind of what I really wanted. Like there was a lot of times crudely where, I wanted to go to bed, but I watched television, or I saw other people doing things, or myself, or just suffering, like classic examples where I would get into fights with people I loved, and just normally you do that, and that's normal as a human being. But as I started to practice meditation and at least read the teachings of Buddhism and others, it was like, oh, there's this whole kind of stream of wisdom tradition that is now getting maybe really into, connected with modern cognitive science, but which had taught, the rider and the horse analogy, that the rider, the rational brain thinks it's in charge, but actually it's the horse or the elephant, the rider and the elephant, that's really deciding what's happening. And so that was the other part of this, which was that, if you like, the wisdom gap, as I would now term it, had been growing. So we have these incredible technologies, we have these incredibly actually complex societies, but we still basically have Stone Age brains. We still have Stone Age minds. And how could we address that wisdom gap was becoming much more pressing to me in thinking about things. And I think that the other thing I would say maybe now was that I always felt an awareness of history, which is actually very neglected, funny enough, in the technological age, it's almost good to not know too much history because then you can be more bold, like, no one's done this before, was very helpful to me. So, for example, you ask about what's happening in the world today, and I actually think there's a really useful, not it's not exactly the same, but analogy, which was, okay, if you go back to the printing press, so 1450, Gutenberg is inventing the printing press, which is a revolutionary information technology, and it's disseminated in the world. Well, what you actually get in the 16th and 17th century is these massive religious wars in Europe, which the printing press may even have contributed to because it allowed people who were Protestants to disseminate stuff. And I think a little bit of what's going on today is we have a civilizational clash on that magnitude. So and it's partly coincidental that that's also when the information age took off, but partly not. And so just like the printing press and its usage was representative of the birth of modernity. And that led to a huge fight. And you say a breakdown of sense making. Well, imagine you're in 1517, Luther's writing his theses, or 1520s. The whole way you made sense of the world for 1,000 years had been that you listened to the Catholic Church and you listened to the king. And suddenly people are coming along and saying, no, don't listen to the Catholic Church. You've got to teach yourself literacy and read this book in English or German or whatever. You've got to read the Bible yourself. I mean, that level of radical shift in like the ground of sense making is partly what's also going on today. And so I think that there are these analogies in history, and those things can coincide. So you can have something that's changing economically and socially, if you like this explosion of potential, the printing press or the internet, and coinciding with this civilizational clash, which then leads to a lot of other stuff that seems to be regressive.
Well, certainly we're seeing that outcome. And also they'll compare the age of Luther to the age of today. There were ideas in play, but there are only a few. Today, you can tune into any formulation you want, from transhumanism to flat earthers to the manosphere to pretty much any nihilist, anything you want is on offer. And so the problem of distinguishing, good stuff from shit is become more than exponentially more difficult than in 1520. And again, this is this capacity problem that humans...
Maybe. I mean, I would say if you go to you go, for example, to the English Civil War, 1650s, you have this kind of a plethora of Protestant sects, like the Quakers to the Levelers. You've got all of this stuff going on. I mean, I don't want to kind of compare. I'm saying is that humans have gone through these moments of bewilderment. And normally part of the issue, I think also, Jim, is that normally most of us don't actually work everything out for ourselves. I mean, this is obvious, right? We have this huge kind of trust apparatus. And for example, in the 20th century, that reached this culmination in, basically science and academia, the university, which is the great institution of modernity, around for about, like the Catholic Church, around for almost 1,000 years, really, in its current form, about 800 years, had reached its apotheosis. And it was like, rather than in God we trust, it was like in science we trust. And what you're seeing, in a way, in the last 30 to 50 years is somehow a bit of a disintegration of that, culminating in what we've been, you've been seeing. Now, there are good and bad things about that breakdown. There's many bad things about that breakdown. There's some good things. But what I'm saying is, just like the breakdown of trust in the Catholic Church in Western Europe, the breakdown in our kind of faith in science, in technology, in rational bureaucracy also leaves us adrift, because we used to trust someone. Well, I could listen to the chief medical officer, I could listen to the president, but people don't really trust those authority institutions anymore. And then they're sort of adrift. And I think that level of kind of deracination, like taking away the roots, your kind of basis of how you make sense, is very destabilizing. But happens at these moments when there's a real clash over where epistemic authority come from. Where does knowledge come from? Where does true knowledge come from? Does it come from science? Does it come from religion? Or does it come from somewhere else? And these moments which we're going through right now as a civil, really in the end of modernity, is incredibly destabilizing. And it will take a while, I think, before the dust settles. You know, who determines who is a man? Is it science that says you're male or female? Is it culture or is it myself? I decide I'm a woman, or I decide I'm a man. Where does this epistemic and ontological authority come from?
And, we are in a highly pluralistic world as these things go, right? There are no firm authorities that apply to everybody, and is that good or is that bad, right? That's an interesting question.
Well, I think I could say, and I think, again, I feel here, I just want to acknowledge the ancestors. I mean, you yourself have talked about, I know also the work, the complexity science, but also the work, and I feel Wilbur and the integral as a kind of distillation, but this point that going back to Habermas, that the world of complete plurality in views is not sustainable, because we need to coordinate and have some ground for reaching consensus. And what we see is what happens without that is like the kind of bitter civil wars, culture wars. The question is, how do we rebuild that? And how do we rebuild it not by going back to the simplistic certainty of modernity where there was science and reason and we just knew what was true? How do we go forward into something that's kind of richer, that includes reason, that includes science, but at the same time, for example, allows space for the transcendent, for that which is transrational? And I think that will happen, but I think it will take years or decades for that renewal to happen. Just as what happened when the Catholic Church broke down. It took centuries before there was a kind of, well, in that case, not even a reunification, but modern science came to basically dominate epistemically and take over from revealed religion. And even today, as we know in the United States even, there are significant groups that still reject the epistemic authority of science and say, and yeah, and go for creationism or something like that. So it takes real time for a culture to switch. And we're very early in really the takeover of postmodernism as a cultural form. And whether you like it or not, and there are many, many critiques of postmodernism that we could talk about, of this issue of like, there's no ground to stand on and so on. But how do we build anew? How do we incorporate those insights, for example, for me at least, of Buddhism or other teachings which go beyond even, kind of, if you like, classic science, but with science? How do we have a marriage of reason and spirit rather than simply rejecting one or the other?
Let's go back to something you said earlier, which I think this is a perfect setup for, which is wisdom. To your mind, what is wisdom?
Well, first of all, I think wisdom is a capacity that is most manifest when you see it done, right? It's like saying, what is it to ride a bike? You have to kind of see someone riding a bike. So, I mean, I'm going to give a slightly analytical answer. Maybe I'll start actually better with the concrete example. So the best version of what I mean by wisdom, and it is an analogy, is this guy, Christopher Alexander, who is an architect. I don't know if the pattern language and so on, but Alexander, yeah. And I don't know if you've read The Nature of Order, which is the masterwork, the 4-volume final work. Okay, so The Nature of Order. So Alexander's trying to really do something that's really exactly the answer, by the way, to what comes after postmodernism. It's really example, because postmodernism really infects architecture really early on, right? Architecture gets taken over by postmodernism, and Alexander is against that. And Alexander says some key things that relate to wisdom. And let me just tell the story of Alexander and I'll answer your question. So Alexander says a couple of things. So the companion book to A Pattern Language, because he has this series in the 70s, it's called A Timeless Way of Building. And in The Timeless Way of Building, Alexander says something really controversial for the modern world and for the postmodern world, which he said, in a way, he says, beauty is real. Or rather more precisely, wholeness and the living is real. There are spaces that have the quality of being more whole or more living compared to other spaces. And this is not a matter of opinion. Unlike modernism or postmodernism, where taste is subjective. He's like, no, of course there's subjective taste and differences and so on. But deep down, there are spaces and places we build, and also places in nature that have this quality more or less of being alive, being whole, being free, being well, flourishing, exactly. And he lists, and what's beautiful is at the very beginning of the Timeless Way, he lists out about 9 qualities. He says, no one of these is exactly this quality that has no name. It is a quality without a name, and you cannot name it, but you can point to it. And this is, so he's doing several things. First of all, he's reasserting that value is real. This is a huge point, both going beyond modernity and post-modernity. There is an up, right? The way I like to say it, there's a mountain and there is an up, even if we cannot see the summit. No one of us has truth. No one of us has perfect beauty, but we can just feel things that have more of this quality or less of it. So that's point one. And secondly, he is incorporating reason. So Alexander, he studies in mathematics at Cambridge University. He gets actually, I think, the first and one of the only PhDs in architecture from Harvard. But he is a mathematician, and so he's quite interested in using reason. And so he also enumerates these qualities of buildings that have this. But he also, in the final book of The Nature of Order, the 4th book, he says, listen, I've got to be honest with you. I've gone through this whole book trying to prove, almost use reason. But I am also going to say this goes beyond reason. And there's something almost like spiritual. There's a kind of ability to sense these spaces that have this quality that goes beyond anything I could write down or say. Now, so Alexander, why this relates to wisdom is, so what Alexander is doing is he's saying this is a quality people who are skilled in this can create in buildings and built environments. This quality of wholeness and beauty. So similarly, wisdom has this thing. So I think the key elements of wisdom are you have valuception. You can sense the good. Now it can be talked about, it can be reasoned about, but it transcends reason. At some point, there's a question of judgment that's kind of somehow, I don't want to say it's not spiritual, but it goes beyond language of like sensing what's the direction of the good, right? And, should I eat this piece of chocolate cake? I can reason about it, but there's a sense deep down, well, it's good for me or not good for me. The second quality of wisdom is the ability to do sense making, discern the direction to act towards that good. Like King Solomon, do I give the baby to that woman, or what kind of actions would I take to discern the truth by saying to this woman, hey, I'm going to cut your baby in half. And the woman whose baby it really is will say, no, give it to the other woman. And then he will know. So there's that part. And the third part of wisdom is the ability to act once you've discerned that path. So if you like, it's this kind of valuception, sensing the good, determining the path towards the good, and then being able to act on it, an ability of will or capacity. And that question of wisdom applies both to individuals and it can apply to groups. And I like to say, you can go from collective intelligence, which I think has that aspect of sense making, but what turns into collective intelligence into collective wisdom is that ability to sense the good collectively and particularly act together towards the good. And that brings me all the way back. Where did this quest begin? I was obsessed with collective action problems. When I became an economist, all of the issues I could see related often back to collective action problems, from climate crisis to the way we did intellectual property rights in the information age, and was often captured by special interests. And the question was, well, how have humans got better at solving collective action problems? And they've rarely done it by having better information. They've done it by developing their collective culture to imagine a larger we. Largely, they've started to think that I am the same, and you see this in very obvious ways where, in a way, we as humans culturally hijack a genetic aspect, which is that I care about my brother and sister, to care about larger groups. So famously, the French Revolution, I'm going to address you as brother citizen or sister citizen. In monastics, you talk, this is my brother, this is my sister. Why do we use that language? Because in doing so, we use this deep genetic caring for kin to enlarge our area of care. Um, I mean, I come back, but that's like, this relates back into wisdom. Like, how do you actually then do these things? How do you become wiser? Well, that's another whole question.
Yeah, I like that actually. I like that framework quite a bit. And I also like the fact that you've put action into the equation. I often, someone asks me what wisdom is, and I just say quite simply, making good decisions. Uh, and and the thing that I think that you add, which is good, is making good decisions in context of a definition of up, so that the results of the decisions, or at least our intent of the decision, is to move up the graph of goodness, essentially. And then I'll also add another thing. Both you and I are interested in complexity as a domain, and something I've added to my own perception of wisdom over the last 3 or 4 years is that the rational realm works good in the complicated spaces, but is much less efficacious in the complex domain. And when we encounter the complex domain, then we ought to delegate our decision making to our intuitions. Our intuitions have been evolved for 3.5 billion years to make good decisions under systems of complexity, and trying to force the rational into understanding what to do in the realm of the complex generally will often give you bad results. So, for instance, on how to have a forest be healthy and rich and nourishing, I much more trust my intuition than I do some spreadsheet analysis on what the optimal food web ought to look like in this forest. And learning how to modulate, because now the part of the error of postmodernism is to say, we're not going to use the rational scheme at all. All right, that's crazy. I also say some of the more extreme hippy dippy woo woos say we're going to do nothing but intuition. In reality, wisdom is knowing when to use what tool in what, when making what class of decisions, when confronted with what kind of systems, so as, I'm going to add your piece to this, to move, have a, to my bets and my belief move upward in the goodness gradient.
Exactly. Yeah, like this, and that capacity. I mean, exactly. I mean, and these points, I suppose one thing I'd say is, in order to actually do several of those things, both the valueception, both to perceive good and often to have this intuitive skill, requires a certain cultivation, sometimes of inner stillness or other things. Like, really, one of the things actually I really, I'm very inspired and influenced by Thich Nhat Hanh and the Plum Village tradition. And, again, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, is so fascinating because he's this great Zen Buddhist teacher, but he's integrating East and West. He's also incredibly intelligent. He goes to Princeton. He's very curious. And one of the things I always fascinated was that he went actually to Google quite a bit at certain points and taught, they were really interested, some of the Googlers. And at one point, I think this story is important, is that he is there and he's saying, listen, we should put a mindfulness bell on people's phone. They were like, what should we do for mindfulness? He's like, well, you can install kind of an Android, a notification bell. And the energy is like, oh, this is great. This is great. And they're like, yeah, we'll create an option for that. And Thich Nhat Hanh's like, no option. It's compulsory. And whether you agree with that or not, the point was that the energy said, no, we can't do that. People have got to be able to choose. Thich Nhat Hanh says, what are you talking about? Of course most people can't choose. They're not like, it's not like he's saying I know better, but he's saying like, I can't choose. Like, it really takes deep practice and reflection, whether you're talking about Buddhist meditation or any practice you're doing, to really have clarity of choice, to really know what you want, is actually really hard. I mean, I can look at my life and think, how I've even spent years of my life doing things that I look back and like, I didn't really want to do that. I spent years trying to become an academic. And I remember when I left academia, I was a fellow at Cambridge for a while. I was like, oh my God, I really feel, I'm so much happier. Like, I just realized I never wanted to be an academic, but I was like, well, it was my family or our society which told me like, oh, it's a really good idea to pursue that career path. That's how I get value. And so to really see in our hearts, to really feel what is the good for ourselves, for our family, for our society, takes real kind of stillness and clarity of spirit, I think. And that's where I also see this kind of integration, which is that that's also true not just for the valueception, but it's also true to use that intuition that you're saying. Like, when do I really want to use what skill? Who do I delegate my sense-making authority to? When do I know when to ask, phone a friend, metaphorically? When do I need to be responsible myself for choices or understanding? These are very deep qualities that mix together reason, and in the best case, integrate reason and something that's more than reason into something, a very special kind of quality that we could call wisdom, I think, at least in part.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Let me follow up because this is actually not even my notes today. We're going to go off to the wild blue yonder. That's okay. You mentioned how difficult it is to individually get these insights and make these kinds of structures in our brains. And, it's true. Most people never do it, right? And I would suggest that culture, correctly thought of, is essentially a scaffolding for those folks who can't, won't, or don't do it themselves. It's call it at its best. I mean, culture can be horrible. There was a Nazi culture. There was an Aztec culture, right? So there's no guarantee that culture is good at all. But one can imagine culture being the shorthand for people to be able to just adapt, to be able to make wise decisions. So culture at its best. And I do believe there's insufficient attention to cultural construction in the social change world. There's institutions on one side and individuals on the other. And in reality, culture is the sea that they both swim in. And it's one of the reasons why in the game B world these days, we're strongly promoting the idea of membranes that build small pockets that have differential culture, a different culture entirely than the outside world, and that culture provides a scaffolding for individual smart thinking and smart action that most people aren't going to get to on their own.
Well, absolutely, Jim. You're like spot on, I think, on several levels in these points. So first of all, actually, I think there's a base point that most of us are not very smart, not just like, for the people who can't. And this is something, Joseph Henrich and many other colleagues now, this kind of emerging cultural evolution science that we've had in the really actually emerging properly in the last 20 to 40 years is, there before, but really showing that really we're not the smart ape, we're the imitation ape. What really distinguishes humans is our ability to copy and imitate others, and therefore have this huge kind of web of collective intelligence, where often I'm not figuring out something really, even by intelligence, but by chance. But once I do figure something out, I can share that with others. Whether it's this food is safe to eat, or here's a way to find water, or, here's a way to navigate something on your iPhone. So that point is really, really important. And I think also at these deeper levels, like culture, not only is this kind of like how to's, it's also this worldview. I think that's the other thing. Like, who do I go to? Who has authority, knowledge authority? Who is knowledgeable in my world? Who should I listen to? How is the world basically put together? These are things that I would call worldviews, I think you're talking, and which I say make up cultural paradigms. So when we talk about culture, we can often think, oh, there's German culture or there's French culture, which is this kind of like, they cook differently, they speak different languages. But at this deeper level, there's these kind of core worldview assumptions that I use the term cultural paradigm. Others use different kind of terms of this, but which underlie, for example, are we fundamentally individuals, or are we somehow really exist relationally? Where does truth come from? Does it come from God? Does it come from science? Does it come from somewhere else? These kind of core assumptions, which most of us never even think about, obviously, but they are coming from our cultures. So that's point one. And then we could say a lot more about that, because what it leads me and others to be very interested at life itself and at in the other projects is the central role that cultural evolution can play in civilizational shifts. We don't have to wait for everyone to become a Buddha or really wise to have shifts, because there's this aspect where, well, culture, you kind of download culture is downloaded as a child from what's around you. If that changes, you can have a lot of change without me having to have done all the work myself.
And most people aren't going to do the work, right? The history is that there's some pioneers that think it through, and then this new paradigm resonates with people, right? And they get adopted. We look at the movement to Christianity as an example. Starts out as a little seed, and it propagates because it's attractive for various reasons in the context it lives in.
Exactly. Or like women's rights or slavery. We don't have to have lots of people sit down and go, I'm really going to think through whether there are certain people who are just naturally born to be slaves or whether there are people, everyone's actually equal. Well, some pioneers could do stuff. They could persuade, maybe even initially like the elite, and they pass laws. And then everyone's like, yeah, well, I don't think legal slavery is a good idea anymore. Or more recently, gay marriage. You have a very rapid dissemination of an assumption that 100 years ago was ludicrous to most people and is now, I think, wonderfully widely adopted. So what I'm saying is, first of all, you're right. There's this huge kind of shortcut that's possible. It can obviously be hijacked in bad ways too, but that's possible. The second point was about pockets, so this membrane. And so this is something as well, like at Life itself and with the Second Renaissance Initiative, we're very interested because you're right, new civilizational paradigms, new things that, for example, to go back to your point about wisdom, what would a culture that was really being able to integrate reason and the transrational really look like? It would have to have new systems of authority where, oh, this person, just like we say, this person's a really good scientist, we'd be saying, oh, this person's really wise. And, there'd be kind of networks of trust, of authority and validation. That's going to not emerge everywhere. It's going to emerge in pockets where we get to pioneer and new, possibly we don't even plan it, but something emerges unintentionally or accidentally, and then it can spread. That's really crucial. And I think one of the things, by the way, and this is a bit of an aside, in that is a bit of an irony of late modernity, and it's something actually like Christopher Alexander also talks about, funny enough, is that we've got much more rigid as society is, and it happens, in the kind of death, I would say the decay phase of many civilizations, is everything gets very rigid. So for example, right now, if I want to set up my own school, I'm here in France, actually it's really hard. If you want to build, you want to go and build your own little village, it's actually got really hard. There's a lot of calcification. And so one of actually the challenges at the moment is, how do we allow more space for cultural experimentation? And one of the difficulties is sometimes it will be abused. Some groups will do things we don't like, but it will also allow space for a lot of things we could like. And it's a tough trade-off. But one of the things that I think is sometimes difficult actually for progressives to accept is that if we allow more charter schools or whatever it is you don't like, but it does allow for a much more kind of like, many flowers to bloom and for us to then discover things. Whereas if we're very uniform and like, oh, it's all got to be this way, we don't see a lot of this experimentation that we could do. Culturally,
I often refer to the idea of widespread membrionics under coherent pluralism as a search in high-dimensional design space for how to live, right? And that is the one good, really clearly good thing that came from the Enlightenment, is to say, let's be suspicious of arbitrary authority that tells us how to live the good life, and let us explore alternative ways to live the good life. And in some sense, the idea of many membranes is an even more radical way of allowing multiple experiments with multiple knob settings. And then, of course, we also talk about having a horizontal information bus so that what works and what doesn't can become more and more widespread. And like in many convergent evolutions, you may well see these membranes approaching each other in terms of how they define the good life. And it will actually in some ways tell us, is there a single or a small set of settings, or is there not? And it's completely legitimate for people to live in different ways. So I think that's a hugely important way of knocking up the conceptualization one higher level, that it's a search in a space that we don't know the answers to.
Exactly. And I mean, this is something we have done at Life Itself. I mean, one of the things that's important in our experience as well is how do we integrate theory and practice. So we've got these points here of like, well, we want to do more experiments. Well, we at Life Itself have done several of these conscious co-living. We've had hubs where people have lived for years or months, in Berlin, here in Southwest France, in London. I think one of the things, just to emphasize again, is that enabling that, not only is there a kind of societal institutional allowance. So for example, societies, the US is actually quite different in a good way, that it's very easy to homeschool. But for example, in Europe, it's very difficult to do homeschooling or to set up alternate schools. Those things really matter if you want to create a different kind of community. The other one is basically land costs and competition for land. So this more comes from, I always say, capitalism in itself, but essentially, to do these things, you might want to not operate in exactly the same economic system that we have today. Just to make it let me get very concrete. Our experience of running hubs, like where people, somewhere between 5 and 20 people might be living, and experimenting with new ways of doing things, it's quite, if someone's having to work 40 hours a week or more in the conventional economy, that often doesn't allow a lot of the time that they would need in the community to, whether make decisions or just experiment with new cultural practices and so on. Um, you know, relational practices. How do we solve conflicts in a different way? How do we start businesses in a different way? And that's a real other issue. So how do you create maybe not the financial freedom, but 100 years ago, there was very cheap land in some places. Now land is very expensive. So people, just very practically, they have this challenge, which is, I want to go and experiment, but if I'm still working 40 hours a week in the conventional economy, it's not going to go very well. So there's this kind of tension. And so these are some of the things I think very practically at the moment that I think about, is like, how could we enable this? So for example, it didn't work out yet at Life Itself with others, but could you create like real estate funds? You'd still own the land, but could you, for example, buy land, maybe at offer then relatively low rents, so the yield on that is not classic real estate investment, but it's still there, and then enable groups to start doing this? Because if you look at why groups like this fail to start, it's basically, one is money, second is interpersonal breakdown, which happens before or after, but and that happens in startups too. And I think the third is kind of a cultural, hey, you're all hippies, are you going to go and all have free sex? No, there's not. You could do lots of other things too in communities. So I think both of us have this real interest in having more, what I would call experimental pockets of coherence, where people are trying out new ways of building businesses, living together, working together, bringing up children, being wiser. And we want to enable many more of those. And at the moment, there are quite a few challenges to that happening, what I've seen over the last decade of our experiments with that.
This is an area of huge interest of mine right now. As we start moving Game B from theory to practice, I've delayed that move, or at least recommended people not, even though some have gone ahead and tried it anyway, almost all of whom have failed, because they haven't gotten those things right. One of the shorthands I use is that a membrane has to work. And this actually comes from where I got the concept of membranes initially, which was by analog from the origin of life. We believe life has basically three components: an information component encoded in DNA and then implemented with RNA, a metabolism, which processes energy and creates energy from raw materials or from sunlight, and a membrane to keep the concentrations high enough and regulated with the right concentrations for the other two things to happen. And this is, why the origin of life is still a head scratcher. Did one of them come first? Some people say membranes came first. Some say metabolism came first. Some say the information processing came first. My suspicion, I wouldn't put a lot of money on this, but I believe the three had to co-evolve together, that you needed them all. You need the membrane to get enough interactions to create both the metabolism and the information realm. You need the information realm to preserve the metabolism between generations, and you needed the membrane to allow the more complicated system to bring in its nutrients and expel its toxins. So it's really hard to see how you got there unless all three co-evolved. And so anyway, that is how I came up with this idea of membranes as the basic building block of society. And I think that's a very interesting insight. The other interesting thing about how does game B, or another one of these alternatives, take down game A eventually, it's worth understanding that our life, descended from a single last universal common ancestor that was not the first life, but was relatively early life. Every single bit of life on Earth, a fungus, a tree, us, a bacteria, all descended from this. Took a long while. So it's possible that the idea of a membrane that can reproduce and can learn and can change could grow over time exponentially and become big enough to produce a tip in the social operating system.
Yes. And I think the analogy is really good also, that just to think of it concretely, if you're trying to create new cultures that would have these characteristics that, for example, we describe in the Second Renaissance Project, what are kind of features you'd like to see as, I've described this wisdom, an ability to integrate, the theory and practice, an ability to maybe go beyond the individual and the collective, somehow integrate into the individual and the collective. All of these kind of features, you need a membrane. So you need some way of the group retaining coherence. Normally that involves, do we eat together? Do we, have rituals of some kind together? Do we practice whatever our, inner practices or outer practices are together? Then there's the energy. If we're not able to generate enough kind of food or money, whatever the equivalent is of energy in the system, well, we're not going to be sustainable. And many groups then on the hippie end fail on that front. They're not pragmatic on that front. And then there's, as you said, the final one of information processing. Can we learn? Can we exchange information? And so on. I think these are really, really good points. And I think one of the things I think is interesting is, if you think of the last wave of intentional communities, ended up being, I would say, quite postmodern-esque and dominated by Eco Village, which has been amazing, and there's wonderful, wonderful things about that. And the eco aspect is a strong sign of the postmodern vision. But the next stage I would like to say is like these conscious, rather than, it's conscious villages. It's villages in which the inner dimension and this balance of the reason and the trans-rational, the integration of these polarities is really happening, is crucial. And that's also, in my experience so far, is often it's the shadows that we have personally and collectively, our lack of inner development in one way or other, my ego, which gets in the way of a lot of the experiments, more even than the energetic problem of money. It's without that kind of practice, that's what really stops us. And so I think this aspect of moving also to the kind of creating the membrane, like you said, almost first, the relational work. What am I doing to be able to look at my shadow? Oh, wow, Rufus, when I was a kid, this is what happened with my mom. My mom wasn't around when I was a little kid, and so I've got this attachment issue, and therefore it plays out all the time. Like when everything goes wrong, I'm like, I don't need anyone, I'm fine on my own, when of course I'm not. Those are the things that blow up kind of collaborations and communities quite fast in unresolved conflict. So if we can find ways to practice that, if we can create developmental spaces, if we can create places which we're really cultivating these capacities and these new practices and experiments, that they may also involve technology, they may involve just relational and cultural things, but if we can be innovating and discovering and sharing, wow, there's real potential for breakthrough here.
Absolutely. We have codified your concept as the personal institutional spiral. One of the things many of us have noticed is our friends go off on 42-day retreats, and they come back and they're much more even-tempered and philosophical and all this. And 6 months later, working in the cubicle farm at the insurance company, they're pretty much back to where they were. And so if they don't have the scaffolding around them every day that sends them signals that doing the right thing is the right thing, then they're gonna revert. 2 or 3% won't, and fortunately, we have those 2 or 3% of hard-headed people who are willing to undergo the change on their own and don't give a fuck what the world thinks. But those people are rare. That's not how Homo sapiens evolved. We evolved to be very well attuned to what our neighbors think of us, right? The status game, etc. And so, as I've been thinking about this more and more, it seems to me that there is no either or answer. It's got to be both more or less simultaneously. And when you talk about the institutionally sides, you talk about institutions that support the good work from personal change. And then further, once you have some personal change, just to your point about failure modes, you can now build different institutions because you have different kinds of people. If you have people that are still 98% conditioned on game A status games, it's really difficult to get real collaboration, especially when it comes to hard work and dirty stuff, right? And so you have to be able to change how people think about themselves and the status games they're playing, as well as the institutions that then take advantage of those changes to scaffold even more individual change. And if you do it right, you get an upward spiral. And I would argue that game A, particularly in the last 50 years or so, has been on a downward spiral. Our institutions make us worse as people. Being worse as people allows us to be co-opted into even worse institutions, and down we go.
Exactly. I mean, I think that layer, I mean, in the metacrisis diagnosis, you have, there's these three layers. There's the human nature layer, where we have some deep cognitive biases. We have ego, we have greed, the status competition, and we also have good things. There are also good seeds of us, of love, compassion, care. And then there's a cultural paradigm level, but above that. And that cultural paradigm can basically, as you say, water or encourage some seeds or others. We can have a world where we're encouraging greed, or we can have a world where we're encouraging compassion and responsibility. And then we have like the institutional technological level of markets and states and AI and media systems. And those three things are kind of causing and interrelating and inter-evolving. But what we really need, as you say, is we want human flourishing and societal flourishing. We've got these three co-evolving domains of the inner, the cultural, and the institutional, and we need them to evolve together. I mean, this is very integral-esque, if you like, but yeah, big +1.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now you mentioned that, and I was considering skipping it, but I think it would be interesting, particularly in the context of what we've been talking about so far, is yourself and your collaborators have done an interesting job of attempting to differentiate between the polycrisis and the metacrisis. You want to take a whack at that?
Yeah, it's really simple. And first of all, the point of having these definitions is not some kind of philosophical dance angels on the head of a pin debate. It's in order to actually help us understand something important. And you brought one example, like what is happening in the world today? Why are we witnessing, an inability to address the climate crisis? Why is there the culture war? And so I think the analogy that I find most helpful is thinking about the early days of HIV epidemic. So what would happen is people were showing up with multi-organ failure or multiple illnesses that they were seeing. They might be seeing like, hey, they've got an issue with their lungs, but they're also getting pneumonia, and then there's this other thing going wrong. And if you look at the early understanding that people were like, well, what's happening? And this is a bit like the polycrisis. We see there's the climate crisis. We see the climate crisis interconnecting and exacerbating, migration issues. And then migration is leading to wars. And then war is leading to, more problems. And there's drought. And there's these kind of multiple factors interrelating. It's very complex or even complicated. And that's what I would call the polycrisis. There are multiple interacting crises, and they are interrelating, and they are causing each other, and so on. But, and that can miss the underlying cause of what's going on. And what the danger is when you're on that top level, it's just a bit overwhelming. I mean, it's like, what am I going to do? Yes, I get that climate change is making droughts, which is causing wars, which is causing refugee crises. And then that's making, climate change even worse because people aren't able, there's no state to be able to implement things, blah, blah, blah.
Oh yeah, climate change causes migration. Migration causes right-wing quasi-fascist politics, which then rejects climate change.
Right, exactly. And that is a valid point. And it can then just be overwhelming. Where can I intervene in this system? And also, it's a world where everything kind of causes everything else. The metacrisis says, okay, that's correct. It's like AIDS and HIV. So the insight was like, oh, there's this virus underlying, which is causing all of these different things. It's causing the immune system to be weak, which is then leading to all of these different breakdowns in your body, which then are interrelating. But the story of the metacrisis, I think, there are different people who define the metacrisis still different ways. But the way I would say it is what makes a metacrisis is it's a crisis at the layer down at the civilizational kind of operating system level. And that operating system is the core worldviews and values that underpin a lot of the institutions, a lot of the ways that we do things. And there's a crisis there. And that only happens about every 500 or 1,000 years. Basically, there's a point, and at the point we're at, modernity is coming to an end. So modernity has been on this huge rise for about 1,000 years from what was before modernity, and now it's basically dominant in the world. But modernity is decaying. So the systems that are core of modernity, like classic modern science, have been hugely successful. The modern state, the core assumption of modernity of rationalism, individualism, secularism, egalitarianism, and so on. These core assumptions have been amazing. They are great. And in the kind of endgame, the light becomes a shadow. So, for example, one core thing of modernity was progress, particularly material progress, which was amazing. And it's now eating the planet. And similarly, rationalism was great. But if you only thing that there is narrow rationalism, then you destroy the forest. You don't understand complexity science. You don't really understand the need for intuition. You don't understand the importance of meaning and purpose to human beings. We're just, atoms bumping into other atoms. So there are these real kind of limits. And so, to the point about the metacrisis, say, oh, there's actually this HIV virus. There's this kind of underlying causation of all of these other factors. And if we need to go down and address that, and that involves cultural evolution, that involves a paradigm shift in our civilization. So rather than, rather than spend money, rather than those banners which say even, systems change, not climate change, what we really need to say is worldview change and systems change, not climate change. And if you don't address the worldview, if you don't address these kind of invisible assumptions, often for most of us, about how the world works, where truth comes from, how we should act, then you're going to really fail in addressing the crises we face. So that's what the metacrisis. In a nutshell, the metacrisis is a polycrisis where the issues, actually the roots of them, go down to the civilizational operating system worldview level.
Very, very good. I've been talking a fair bit with Brendan Graham Dempsey, and he's done a lot of thinking and writing about worldviews. And, he is now saying, which I think is interesting. Let me back up a little bit. Breitbart, the publisher, long since died, used to say politics was downhill from culture. And part of that was the strategy of the right-wing culture wars, right? Spin up culture, then get control of politics. Brendan has added to that, which is that culture is downhill from worldview. And so that worldview may actually be the best lever to try to move, which will then implies a culture, which then implies a politics. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I mean, what I call what I would agree on, so just for people listening, worldview are these core, I would say, assumptions, just to go through the list, what's real, ontology, what actually exists. Does God exist, or not probably. Does Father Christmas exist or not? Where does truth, assumptions about epistemology, like where does truth come from? Does truth come from the church? Does it come from scientists? Does it come from some inner sense of myself? Does it come, do we all make up truth ourselves in a postmodern way? And the third one, classically in core and worldview, would be basically morality or ethics. What do I value? What's important? Is it honor? Is it success? Is it finding my own truth and being authentic to myself? Is it evolution in my consciousness and in my society? What's most important to me? And those things, I'm using the term civilizational paradigm. So the way I think of it, maybe an analogy with, phyla and animals, is you think there are lots of different kinds of mammals, right? We all, there's dogs, there's cats, there's us, there's elephants, but they're all mammals. They all have some common feature that makes them part of the evolutionary tree. Similarly, you have a lot of different cultures: German, French, American, Japanese, Nigerian, Ukrainian, and so on.
Australian, indigenous, we got some fairly different ones.
Right, we've got some very different ones. What I'm saying is they have shared kind of like paradigms. And so roughly in the world today, there are about 3 or 4 basic paradigms. Most countries, at least their elites, are running on a modern paradigm. Some countries are running on a pre-modern paradigm. For example, Iran, classically, like authorities coming from, God and from the a representative or kind of, the imam or whoever's kind of channeling the truth of the prophet. And then you have postmodern societies. There are a few Nordic countries maybe, and then you've got some indigenous societies that might be even like pre-modern in various ways. And by the way, it's important to say these are not necessarily better. It's not like being postmodern makes you better than being modern. They're just like is it better to be a human or an elephant or a bacteria or an ant? I mean, it's not obviously morally better to be a human than an ant even, but they are different places in the evolutionary tree, and maybe in terms of complexity. And so what I think absolutely what Brendan's referring to, I would say worldview is this kind of characteristic of the civilizational paradigm and this level below. So France and, for example, Germany and America and even China actually share a lot of the current worldview assumptions of modernity. So, they're secular. They don't think the state should be run by a church or something like that. They are, even whatever you think of communism, but as original or not, but they're generally individualistic. They're generally rational. The China's got a lot of technocracy. So is the US. They're both look to scientists for authority and things like that. So this kind of point, exactly, culture like French or German and other things are downstream of like cultural paradigm, which is itself like corely anchored in this worldview of what we value, what's real, where's truth come from.
All right, I'm going to put a hardball to you. What would you suggest as a worldview for what comes next?
Well, we actually say some of that on the Second Renaissance website, which is our kind of best effort at trying to set out a vision of, and accessible. One of the things here is these ideas mainly are coming from other people, from Nugent, from Wilbur, from many other kind of ancestors who've contributed. But basically there are 5 features compared to modernity. So you can even compare them. So you kind of go from reason to wisdom to the transrational. You go from material progress to kind of, I guess I would say, cultural evolutionary progress. You don't care so much about more GDP. You care about growing in some sense of what it means to grow as a human being. That includes wisdom, but there are other ways we grow in an inner way. And we have a lot of evidence now that that's possible even in adulthood, that we don't just stop growing, not just physically, but we can grow innerly. You have Keegan, you have all this work on ego development, on inner development that we have now over the last 50, 60 years. That's really quite recent work showing how we can evolve as human beings in ourselves. Then you also have, I guess, going beyond, I would say, capitalism and communism. Now, this is more uncertain to a new kind of economic system. That, what that exactly looks like. But I think actually open source and information is actually intriguing in this way, because you have, for the first time in human history, that the main thing we make is costlessly copyable. So we could combine, the need for innovation and kind of reward, but with a kind of free sharing. There are ways to combine that. We could say that. So that's three aspects, and then we've got going from individualism to interbeing. So what is it to really recognize the deep interwovenness of each other and the nature and the living beyond human? How do we recognize and respect that? How do we act from that in a much more collective way, but without going back? We're not trying to go back to become ants, or even, I would say, pre-modern tribes. We're not trying to dissolve back into the collective. We're trying to take the autonomy and the individualism that we have created or evolved or developed, the individuation that Jung talks about of the last millennia. There's a huge victory for humans that they're not given by their village, and that if I'm different, I'm probably going to be killed or expelled. That I can be different. That we can go beyond patriarchy and go back into a more collective model, away from the hyper individualism that we've ended up in. And again, Thich Nhat Hanh, who's the person who came up with that phrase "into being" that many people speak to, is also like Thomas. I met Thomas Steininger and Elizabeth de Bold and many others who worked on emergent dialogue, but other practices that really allow us to see how could we keep our individuality but come into a collective space together, where we really can kind of, in a way, enter a collective field where we really are somehow coming one in a way, but without merging in some kind of weird kind of way back into the goo of the collective or the communist nightmare. So that's another one. So individualism to interbeing. And finally, going beyond secularism. I think this is the most controversial, you might say, but we humans need something that looks like a religion. Now, in modernity, that religion is kind of become capitalism and rationalism. We worship science. We just released a white paper called In Tech We Trust, but whose subtitle would be Technology is God. And if you look at what we've done with technology, it's going to give us eternal life. It's what we look to give us the truth. It's what we dedicate our purpose to. We'll go to Mars. The purpose of our lives is to build, to go take over the solar system or the galaxy with von Neumann probes. With AI, we're going to upload ourselves into the machine. We need a religion, but the issue is we need a religion that is non-dogmatic and non-oppressive, and that's pluralistic and that allows for plurality and difference. Well, and we need that to come back into society in a more rigorous way. We want to allow for a big dream, a big vision, because without that, we perish. I mean, I think that there's actually a line that we have in the Life Itself kind of manifesto, which is from Proverbs, which is, without a vision, the people perish. And the truth is, one of the reasons we're in the situation we are today is that we have been without a vision. Since God died 2 centuries ago in the West, and communism, which was a disaster in many ways, but communism was the kind of dream, the utopian dream, died 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. But no really sensible, I'm not criticizing Marx out there, but very few kind of progressives really believe in like classic communism anymore. And so we let
Chinese, by the way.
Well, no, they're really just fascists. They're not really communists at all.
Exactly.
They're just fascists. But my point is that we've been bereft of a real vision for transformation. And I think this is one of the things, again, I would credit Wilber and others from the integral movement with, is Wilber's point, I think, that and we call it ontological politics, which is not a great name, but the politics of being, which is, once we see this possibility that you're also describing in Game B and your colleagues, which is we can evolve as a society ontologically and institutionally, that is a dream worth giving our lives to. So suddenly you have something. Now, it's not a naive communist dream of like, oh, we're all just going to own the means of production and then hold hands and walk into the sunset. No, it's not easy, but we can transform ourselves. We can transform our societies. We've done it before. We once had our lives ruled by the divine right of kings. We lived in a world where if I was a peasant, my lord could come and like sleep with my wife on my wedding night, or could take from me, or torture me, or dispossess me. We lived in a world where if I questioned the truth of the church, I was executed or tortured or expelled. That world has been transformed. That is a miracle. And miracles can, in that sense, we should believe in utopia. And that's why we call ourselves at Life Itself pragmatic utopians. We want to have a big vision, which we have now that we can see that we can evolve our culture and our consciousness and our institutions. That is a dream, that evolution can keep happening and go take us forward. And we need to be pragmatic about it and rooted and grounded.
Now, question, maybe a challenge. If the vision is to build better society, for what purpose? So that's a short term. I mean, and I'm full of this tension, right? If we don't get through the next 100 years, doesn't really matter what our longer term vision might be as humanity. But it strikes me that from the big picture arc, say the equivalent of going to heaven and living forever in the presence of the Almighty, producing a better social operating system seems like pretty small potatoes.
Well, I think there are two. I'll just say again, I'm drawing the word, but one is that and I'm going to be straight up here. I mean, I'm a Buddhist, and my own personal experience. What I love about Buddhism is Buddha said, really practice for yourself. There is both this ability to have kind of self transcendence. I mean, maybe I've only had tastes of it in my life so far, or days where I've dwelt in that kind of space. So, but I think this is something, again, Wilber really nails, which is there's two directions of, if you like, the developmental space of humanity and of consciousness and human beings is multidimensional, right? So just like I could run really fast and I could be really strong, right? But I might just be able to run fast and not be strong. Similarly, I can wake up. I'm going to use that term, which again comes from the integral, but I can wake up to my true nature and my liberation in the Buddhist sense. I can go to nirvana in this world, like in that sense of going out of the of transcending the self. The three doors of liberation. Selflessness, emptiness and selflessness, signlessness, going beyond concepts, and going beyond and going to aimlessness, going beyond trying to attain anything. And I can evolve worldview and my society. And those two things are related but interdependent. So there have been Buddhas and there have been enlightened people, you will say, for millennia. And society's evolution, worldview evolution, and kind of, technological capacity evolution is distinct from that. Buddha lived in a world where he almost didn't let women ordain as nuns, where even Buddha was like, well, I'm going to allow untouchables to become monks, but I'm not going to allow women. I mean, that's an example where you could be enlightened, but still be given by a worldview of your world where women just weren't allowed to do these things. So we can evolve in both dimensions. So if you ask what I would say as an aspiration for humanity, for me and for my own life, is to wake up and to make awakening society, which is one in which people are waking up and they're pursuing their own inner kind of evolution, all these different dimensions. I could name some of those dimensions if it's helpful, but I could go through them more. But at least waking up and growing up, which is like waking up to my true nature and growing in terms of my level of compassion, my worldview, and so on to the maximum extent. And that evolution of society never ends. We don't know where we could be in 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. I mean, who knows where we could be? And I think one of the limits of us today is if you read science fiction, and if you read even positive science fiction, so you read like Ian M. Banks' The Culture Trilogy, he can imagine that we have fast and light travel. It's like Star Wars. You can imagine lightsabers, but you can't imagine that Darth Vader got therapy. So you have these things like Ian M. Banks, all these people, they're doing stuff, but it's kind of like us, but with lightsabers. We can't imagine what it would have looked like to actually transform our culture. Not other than that we're pacifistic and we've just got as much as we want. Many of the people in the culture stories, at least as human beings, they're still quite petty. They're quite naive. They're not very wise. So what I really want to imagine is a world, of real sages, that we could be real sages and really joyful and happy, like a kind of an unbelievable level in a way, but not because, we've got some AI pushing our pleasure buttons, but because we have woken up to our true nature.
I'll come back to it. Then what? What do we do with that, right?
Well, I think the thing of that is that one deep answer to that is that you stop. Well, I think one is that I think the world, the universe mysteries are vast and great, and just continuing the deepening of our understanding, and I would even say going beyond our understanding, our comprehending, our feeling into the magnificence and greatness of the world. I think the other is to like the Bodhisattva vow, we don't want to no, we don't want to stop until um we alleviate all suffering of all living beings. We want a world where, by suffering, I don't mean pain. There might still be pain in the world or learning, but I mean suffering is alleviated. So we'd like a world where, and then why not to infinity and beyond? Why not go for the light cone? Sure. But I think you want to have worked out whether you really want to go, whether you really want us to expand, what is really wise for human beings. And right now, we're almost killing ourselves because of our inability to stop, because we always want more. We want to know more. We want to have more. I mean, and I see this even in AI, just as a side note, the incredible, certainly even in the last few months, I'm a coder. What you can do with AI is amazing. It's kind of a bit mind-blowing the last 2 or 3 months. There's been moments I've been staying up to 4 a.m. coding again when I haven't done that for a long time. And I can see the grasping in me. I can see that what could easily happen, let alone super intelligent, but even with these tools, I would just want to do more. I wouldn't be satisfied. I'd just be like, okay, now I can do more. Now I want even more. And that energy has to be transformed before we can actually even know where we want to go to in the universe or what we want to offer. And I think there's also a humility. I think the world, we get a bit, for me, the world is deeply alive, and consciousness is not just located in my head. We could go into this, but what I'm trying to say is the mysteries of our world are pretty deep. And I think we've only scratched the surface of what those are. And so, yeah, I would hope in 1,000 years, one of the things is that we're able to go slowly and wisely, for example, when we develop new technologies, rather than rush forward at whatever pace we can, despite the risk to ourselves and the living.
Yeah, and AI is a perfect example, which I've been pondering a bit and talking to people a fair bit about. In fact, I have a weekly call with some of the AI industry insiders, talk about these things. And, from the perspective of the arc of the universe, whether humanity reaches artificial superintelligence in 2028 or in the year 10,000 doesn't matter.
No, what matters is we make actually, yeah.
And that if we took our time, our chances of blowing it are much, much smaller. However, this is the central, one of the 2 or 3 central game B analyses, this one from Daniel Schmachtenberger, is the which he got from Scott Alexander. Anyway,
you mean the idea of Moloch?
But the Moloch idea, the multipolar.
These are collective action problems. These are just arms races, which are old problems. Yeah.
And let's just apply this directly to the AI situation. I see it as 3 nested multipolar traps which drive AI. First is OpenAI wants to beat Anthropic, and Google wants to beat both of them to make more money, right? Or just frankly for the ego of Sam. I think Sam is more interested in ego than he is in money, probably, though he likes money too, obviously. So that's number 1, but it's only number 1. Number 2 is in a financialized capitalist society, all companies are constantly in competition for investment capital. The pension funds, the state sovereign wealth funds, etc., and the mutual funds, and they're all trying to optimize return. In fact, they're even more psychopathically oriented to increasing return than the companies are, because that's all they have. They don't add any value other than return. They don't build anything, they don't do anything. And so, but there's an intense competition at that level, which forces even more optimization from the companies because they're competing for the capital one level up. And then the third level that applies to AI for sure, and to some other technologies, but not all, is the geopolitical multipolar trap. How many times have I heard, including from some very smart people, I don't know, wise people, well, if we don't do it, the Chinese will, and we can't let that happen. So we had three nested that essentially drive AI ahead at the fastest possible speed. When the right answer would probably be, yes, AI is amazing, but let's pace ourselves, people. But there's no way to get there.
Well, so this is what. So funny enough, I mean, so I came from an economics background, and I'd also done policy activism around intellectual property, like actual. I'd done floor fights in the European Parliament that I actually won, which is very, very rare, to reject like the Software Pants Directive in 2005. So I'd seen from very early on, and even as I said, from my like being a 9-year-old, collective action problems. This was my obsession in a way. And this is also what led me to cultural evolution, because if you ask yourself, well, how in human history have we solved collective action problems like this? What has been the engine of our cooperation? Well, you are the answer is, well, there's been these kind of deep cultural changes that have happened, and I think normally they have been a large engine of them, not the only engine, has been war. So basically, intergroup, classic evolutionary biology now. And I think Peter Turchin sets it out very well. There's got a book about war about this, but essentially that when you have intergroup competition, when groups are competing, obviously if any given group can cooperate better internally, that makes it better, particularly at fighting, but a variety of other things. And this is what, well attested through lots of stories through human history. What were the Athenian hoplites who had to stand together to fight the Persians or whatever. And so there's interesting, okay, war's been an engine, leaving that aside from it. But what it leads to is normally some kind of stories, like either what we value in a society as being kind of loyal or brave or things like that, or in Christianity, other stories where basically there's some large group of believers that you'll go to heaven, that, if you do these things. And we have had these incredible cultural evolutionary breakthroughs, including in the modern state. I think one of the breakthroughs in the French Revolution was they could raise an army like never before. Previously, you had to basically, no peasant really wanted to fight for the king that much. I mean, you could force them and you could pay mercenaries, but there were limits on the size of your army. Suddenly in the French Revolution, I'm a citizen. I'm going to fight to protect, the revolution. And so you could have this levée en masse, the largest army to ever put in the field before. And that's also a big engine of democracy. It's hard to fight for a dictatorship, or well, at least traditionally it was nationalism. So why I say all of this is what led me is that the true answer is a difficult answer, is there aren't really a lot of shortcuts. It's why actually our new podcast is called Over the Mountains, because there's this moment in Lord of the Rings where they're like, hey, we need to go to the Mount of Doom. Do we go over the mountains? And then there's this big problem. They're like, oh, there's this shortcut. We'll go through, the halls, under the mountains where the elves are. And of course, it's kind of a disaster. And in normal books, by the way, it would have been game over. Gandalf was taken out by the Balrog. It would have been end of the series, but of course he's resurrected. But what I'm trying to say is at this moment, tend to be desperate for shortcuts. And there is an answer, which is we have had breakthroughs to this new levels of human cooperation. And that has happened, and it can happen in this case, where we could see the need for humans to really come together at a planetary level. It's the next level of human cooperation. We've got to the state level, and we need to go another level, to the level of the planet as a whole. The difficulty has been that normally groups have got bigger by fighting other groups, the US versus the Chinese or the Russians or whatever. And at this point, we can't do that anymore. Now, the one irony about AI, and I don't want to demonize AI, but the point I would make is AI is an other. And if people were to say, oh, this is a threat to humanity. It could be the one thing that would unite people. And I don't in any way joke, but I would say at the moment, tragically, given the state of humanity, given our current levels of wisdom, almost the best thing that could happen is like there be some AI error in the US and China fairly simultaneously that led to some significant accident, and that would be a catalyst for cooperation on AI regulation and other things. But that, very simply, that has almost been my journey from saying, okay, I care about making the world better. That leads to collective action problems. Most of the ways that make the world a lot better, that aren't, well, just capitalism and markets, involve collective action. And then your question is, how have we got better at collective action in human history? And that answer is, we have created a larger we. We have gone from the small group to the tribe, to the mini state, the bigger state, and so on. And that is what we need at this moment in human history.
All right. On that relatively helpful note, let's wrap her up. Any final things you want to say today?
Well, I haven't mentioned the Second Renaissance much at all, but if you're interested in these things, the Second Renaissance project, I think that can be linked maybe in the show notes, secondrenaissance.net is where a lot of this vision ideas, and it's a project that's initiated by Life itself, but collaborating with others, many others, to try and start this kind of movement. And the name is just to try and make something accessible, to say we need a civilizational renewal on the scale of the last Renaissance in the West. And this is not Eurocentric. It will happen all over the world in different places. We need that. And I guess this is a point both of like darkness, there's the metacrisis, there is this aspect that we are facing very profound risks and challenges, most obviously because of this wisdom gap, because our technological powers have so exceeded our ability to manage them. And those powers, put in danger ourselves and our planet and the living. And at the same time, there is hope. Why have we called it the Second Renaissance and not the Metacrisis Project? Because renewal and regeneration is possible, and there is hope. And it does take us to come together like never before, both in the local level, in creating these pockets of, membranes and, of renaissance, of renewal, and at a kind of global level, almost kind of interwoven and simultaneous. And that's the dream of my lifetime and for my children, and of others here at Life Itself. I know here I'm today representing Life Itself, and I should say there are many others involved, including my co-founder Sylvie and Liam and others. But yeah, this is what we're dedicated to. And please come join us. That's not just us, but the others. There are others now acting on these things. You are not alone if these things resonate with you. Come and participate. Come and join in. Come and take action. The time is now.
All right. Well said. Rufus Pollock, I really want to thank you for an extremely interesting conversation today.
Jim, I've loved it. So much appreciation to you. So much also acknowledgement to you and other colleagues at Game B and the other projects who've been real ancestors of what's happening at the moment. So thank you so much for that, and contributors to it and actors right now in it. So yeah, real love to you and to everyone else in this kind of community.
Well, thanks a lot. The Jim Rutt Show is produced by Andrew Blevins. Audio and video edited by Stephen Lowe. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.